Good evening and welcome to tonight's edition of Fact Sheet, where we discuss the issues dispassionately, try as much as possible to separate the facts from the chunk, and then we discuss them thoroughly here on Fact Sheet. My name is Samuel Ishen, and I welcome you to the very first edition in the year 2020. Tonight we are discussing a very important event which took place today in Parliament when His Excellency the President Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo gave his final State of the Nation address in Parliament today, where members of the 7th Parliament witnessed the State of the Nation address by His Excellency the President. The things we picked out of the address by His Excellency the President, that which has to do with the state of the economy presently as we speak, that which has to do with our fight against COVID-19, that which has to do with the state of affairs when it comes to the security of our nation, issues to do with corruption, issues to do with the protection of the lives and properties of Ghanaians, issues to do with Galamsey and many more. Tonight, we try to look at the issues as were presented by His Excellency the President moving forward, what your expectations were, whether they were touched on by His Excellency the President or not. That's the focus tonight on Fact Sheet. You're welcome to the show. Tonight we are discussing the last State of the Nation address by His Excellency the President Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo today in Parliament. The highlights of his delivery, that which has to do with education, free SHS, and how it's benefited the people of Ghana and how it's become an integral part of our education system. The TVET as well, issues to do with food security, how planting for food and jobs has become, you know, an opportunity for Ghanaians to get more jobs and also create security for food in the country. There are several other issues His Excellency the President touched on, but for the benefit of our viewers who may not have had the opportunity of listening to His Excellency the President or viewing him during the live telecast of the event, we would want for you to take a view at some of these clips, and then I would invite my guests to join me this evening for us to deliberate on the things that His Excellency touched on.
Speaker, probably the most difficult problem the government met on coming into office was the state of the banking and financial sector. Many of our banks were in distress and had been kept on unsustainable and artificial life support by the central bank. The supervisory agencies were unfortunately not performing their duties, and the governance and management structures of many of the banks were clearly not adequate. If truth be told, many of our finance houses were running what can only be called glorified Ponzi schemes and had lured many depositors into these schemes. We were in a desperate situation, and urgent radical measures had to be taken to prevent the collapse of the entire financial and banking sector. The Bank of Ghana, under new leadership, intervened and has restored sanity to the sector, and in the process, we have saved the banks involved and 4.6 million depositors' funds. The government has had to find some 21 billion cedis to fund the cleaning up exercise. This exercise has enabled a more robust financial and banking services sector to emerge, the better to finance the rapid development of our nation. Speaker, there are painful lessons that we all have to imbibe from this debacle. There is no question but that many people got attracted to the unsustainable high interest rates that some of these financial houses were offering. In all financial dealings, we have to accept what the experts tell us, that whenever whatever on offer sounds too good to be true, it invariably ends up being untrue and unsustainable. Government is committed to paying all validated claims, and I expect the process to be completed Soon after, the courts grant the liquidation orders for the remaining failed fund management companies.
That's His Excellency Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo delivering his last State of the Nation address, focusing a bit of attention on the banking sector. And to help me digest issues to do with finance, issues to do with the economy, which His Excellency the President spoke about, especially when it comes to the impact that COVID-19 has had on the economy of our nation. It should not be lost on us. The remarks made by the minority leader when he was given the opportunity. He also spoke about the state of affairs of the economy and, the situation of our economy, the debt situation of our country. Dr. Lord Mensah is a senior lecturer at the University of Ghana, and he's with the finance department of the University of Ghana, and he joins me tonight to discuss these aspects of the conversation, which has to do with the economy, which has to do with the banking sector, and how the future looks like, especially with a parliament which has 137 for the NPP and 137 for the NDC. Dr. Lord Mensah joins us via Zoom tonight. Doc, good evening.
Yeah, good evening, Sammy, and good evening to our viewers.
It's good to have you on the show today.
Yes, good to have you as well for the opportunity given me.
So let's begin the conversation with, what you picked from the delivery by His Excellency, the President, not necessarily on issues to do with the economy or finance, but in generality, the few things you picked from the delivery by His Excellency, the President.
It is a kind of submission that under normal circumstance, the President needs to, give you accounts of what he's done in the past 4 years. And from all indications, he painted a very good picture, which clearly tells you that, yes, for all the challenges that we've had coming into play, COVID and all those, the economy is generally resilient. But then the question is that the real picture as people see it? I always say that if we are to go by anything, let's use the elections as a gauge, as a measure of how people felt as far as your policies are concerned, how people felt as far as your choice of, leadership are concerned in this country. If you look at the elections clearly, it gives you the signal that people were not happy. And if you look at a split in parliament, which has to do with, almost 50-50, clearly the signals were clear. A situation where parliament has been overturned from, about 40% down to almost 50-50, gives you the signal that, maybe people were not feeling the policies that were being rolled out. But hey, of course, it is the President's day to give us the accounts. And what is on paper is what he read to us. And I believe that generally that is not what Ghanaians, see. If you look at some of the lists that, he come out with, specifically, they were things that were promised, during the manifesto, time before they came to power. And in the end, these are things that effectively you should expect that it will be delivered up to a certain level. And in the end, he outlined all those, things like one district, one factory, 1 million, one constituency. And clearly, how to measure those things, for me, it's not that clear as we sit here.
Let me take you back, Doc, for a second about the point you made about, the elections and how that's a reflection of the mood of the people in terms of the performance of the administration by His Excellency Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo. What's the correlation between elections and then the general performance of the economy?
Well, if you are thinking about elections, the last election we went into, that on the 7th December election, I saw two things, driving, the elections. One is corruption. And then two is, how the policies that the government is rolling out, how they are feeling it. Which, for me, I think is a way of comparing what was promised in the manifesto and the realization of it going into the election. And I believe that chunk of the people saw a huge deviation from, what was being promised and the realities on the ground. And if you ask me the correlation, there's a strong correlation, because what is being promised is exactly why the people gave you the mandate to come and rule them. So if you have ruled them for the 4 years, they are asking themselves, maybe you promised them or you want to fight corruption, right? You want to fight corruption. By the time we go into election, you saw the scandals and then the things that were coming out clearly gives you the signal that the government have lost touch of the control as far as, the corruption is concerned. And then the next one is, if you promise one district, one factory, and then you promise 1 million constituency, 1 million, one constituency, how many people are feeling it? Are the constituencies generally feeling that 1 million? Okay. So all these things are things that people will look out for and then decide on where to put, their vote. And I believe that, the splitting of, the vote or the gains by the minority are the signals that, effectively people are not really happy with, what was promised and what is being delivered. So there's a strong correlation.
Are we not holding certain things constant in our conversation, especially for the year 2020, where the world was on its knees as a result of the presence of COVID-19, where America, for that matter, was suffering from the impact of COVID-19 on its economy and then on its healthcare delivery system as well. And so if we have a nation where in 2019, economists and finance folks will tell us that our macroeconomic indicators were solid until COVID-19 impacted on the economy, is that not, what we should be focusing attention on?
Well, I think if we talk about all things being equal, okay, in economics, in Latin, it says ceteris paribus, clearly you will get to understand that COVID is a universal thing. Ghana was not the only country that was impacted as far as COVID is concerned. COVID was a global thing. So if we are counting your performance, as I sit here, I will not necessarily attribute chunk of your non-performance to COVID, because COVID comes to, hits the entire global economy. And it's more or less a systematic thing, which for me, it's not about how to, measure it or make a noise about it. It's a new normal, which we need to adapt and then jump on to another thing. So for me, I think we had about 3 years before the COVID. And if I'm supposed to assess this government based on what he promised, I'm not going to use the COVID times. I'm not going to use the COVID times because it's out of the norm. I'm going to use from 2017 all the way to 2019. What was the government able to deliver? And most of the promises were within, if you go to the manifesto, you clearly see that they mentioned them, within 2 years we'll provide this. Within 1 year we'll provide this. So there were timelines that were attached to it. So effectively, I'm not going to judge, any government based on COVID. It's an out of norm, it's an outlier. If you give me a plot of the happenings in economies, we're not going to, use COVID for a discussion.
Well, it's interesting your point of view, because prior to the election, we had your own institution, the University of Ghana, conduct a survey where the survey suggested more than 60% of Ghanaians were satisfied with the output of the government in terms of their promises that they had, made. There were several other civil society organizations which similarly conducted polls and surveys which suggested people were satisfied with the promises that had been made and the delivery of these promises.
Yes, it sounds interesting to refer back, this research that came up. If you are saying that 60% of the people are satisfied, more than 60% of the people are satisfied with, the government's delivery, then it should have reflected in the elections. At least we should see that correlation. So I don't know the kind of sample that was used. And if you look at the elections, clearly there's a deviation from what the research presented. So effectively, it tells you that there were some biases in terms of maybe sample collection or something.
But Doc, can
So
we really use the elections as a benchmark or, a test case in the sense that each particular constituency, for instance, if you're using the members of parliament, which you have been referencing, that, now it's 137. Previously, it was way bigger a gap. Now, are the conditions not different if you look at the ground? For instance, I'm a member of parliament in my constituency. The people accuse me that throughout my stay as a member of parliament, doubling maybe as a minister, I was not visiting the constituency, and so because of that, they decided to vote against me. How is this in any way linked to promises unfulfilled?
Very good question. I mean, those are, externalities as far as what deliveries are concerned, where the people will be requesting for the presence of the parliamentarian, at funerals, at outdoorings and all those. I would say those are externalities.
Those are the major factors.
Yeah, but we need to get things clear here. There are core things that we need to, look at, which is development to the people. I mean, the development that were promised, did it get to the people? Because I think if I have my roads, right, I have the hospital that I'm supposed to attend to is closer to me. If I'm supposed to, go to the market and I'm not supposed to walk for more than 10 miles, if I don't drive on dusty roads, if I get potable water to drink, MP's presence at funerals and at outdoorings and all those places will not be relevant to me. So I think we need to look at the core things. We shouldn't, rely so much on those cultural externalities, which, it's part of us. In every society.
But they influence voting.
But Sammy, let me tell you, I'm not an MP. But you know the number of people who, expect that maybe at their funeral at my village, I will be visiting them at any point in time. You will never know. It's a cultural thing. So effectively, for me, those are externalities that we shouldn't bank our hopes on in terms of determining whether an MP is doing well or not. I believe that there were core things that drive this election, and that is development to the people. Inclusive development, ensuring that the people get what they want, which was exactly what was promised. And effectively, you could see clearly that the people were not feeling what exactly has been promised to them, and that is why we got those trends in our voting patterns.
Now, let's go to the tangibles, which I know you'll be very conversant with when it comes to some of these things, the macro indicators, where, your inflations come in, where the performance of your currency also come in, where, for instance, policy rate consistently from 2017 has been coming down until 2020 when COVID-19 hit this country. The country's ratings in terms of, Fitch and the rest of them, the Bretton Woods institutions, was around B+. It wasn't until 2020 when COVID-19 struck that we had some of these ratings coming from B+ to B- and the rest of them. Before COVID-19, the economy was sound. Not so, sir?
Yeah, it sounds better to say that, yes, the economy was sound. Clearly, we saw very good, economic indicators being paraded, on the screens, on the webs, and then what is being communicated to the public. But then in the end, we have to look at the reflections of it. Now, effectively, you might say, okay, fine, interest rate is coming down. Now, you might say that treasury bill rate is coming down. Now, before the government, when this government came to power, there were a lot of, restructuring to ensure that monetary policy rate will have a direct effect on interest rate on the market. We didn't see that. And that is when they introduced that, GRR, Ghana reference rate. And in the Ghana reference rate, you will see treasury bill rate as one of the main indicators in determining lending rate. You will see monetary policy rate as a direct, driver of the lending rate. We look at this GRR, Ghana reference rate, plus, the bank's, premium that they will put on the loan pricing to determine whether the individual is capable of paying or not. That is the risk premium that they add on to the GRR. So if you look at it carefully, if the economies are doing very well, and the monetary policy rate is coming down effectively, and the treasury bill rate is also coming down. And then looking at the address system that we've had, okay, where you can easily identify people. We've introduced ID cards and all those, which you can easily, identify the individual who walk to the bank. We should have expected that the lending rate will also come down in the banking hall. Did we see that? We didn't. So effectively, we're seeing all those indicators clearly coming down. But then as to the reflection of how comfortable you walk to the bank and say, I've borrowed this amount, I'm going to do business. As far as I know, when I take this money and then I put it in business as a capital, in the end, by the time I will make gains, right? Inflation will still be fixed, and I'll be comfortable to say that I can pay back the loan with interest on it. We didn't see that. Businesses were not comfortable in walking to the banking halls.
But you agree with me, interest rates were not the same from 2017 up to 2020. Interest rates had declined, I think, from around, the 27% to around 23, 22% thereabout. There had been some form of reflection in terms of the monetary policy rate, its impact in the banking, sector when it comes to loans and the interest people were paying.
Yeah, but Same, you see, interest rates were coming down. But the question you need to ask yourself is, did the banks had money to lend? Okay? Interest rate can come down, but then in the end, if there's no money available, it doesn't matter the level of interest rate. The bank will still hold on to the little money that they have. And they will require that, you pay the realistic interest and on every single money that they lend. So effectively, I would say that there was a liquidity problem, right? Issues of interest rate coming down, but there was no money to lend. And so as far as liquidity problem exists, you can bring the interest rate down from that, range of 25 to 30 and bring it to around 23, but you will still not get that response from the business.
It's interesting the point you make, Dor. Banking sector and the fact that you say that the banks were not fully capitalized enough to have the capacity to lend to people, because that is what I believe the banking sector, cleanup exercise was to achieve, where banks would be, recapitalized enough, would have the capacity enough to lend out. And from the president, if you listen to him, he made a point about how they saved certain banks, how funds of depositors were saved. He made a point about how, proud to the banking sector cleanup, some banks were virtually operating as Ponzi schemes. But you're telling me all these activities by the Bank of Ghana, which was over 20 million plus, it amounted to nothing when it comes to the capacity of the banks to lend?
Well, let's look at the time lapse. When we had that restructuring, the reformation, and when, the regulator started reacting by, paying, all those banks to ensure that depositors get their fund. Some of them, as of the time that we're about to go into elections, that was when, individuals and, receivers were getting money to, pay for these depositors. So effectively, I would say that, yes, the reforms came, but then in the end, the banks were not that liquid enough because there was a delay. That delay was when money was supposed to go to them to, re-energize the banks again. In the end, I remember before the reforms, these banks were struggling on their balance sheet. And the main problem they were having was on the upper part of their balance sheet, where we have the cash needs, and then we have, the possible easy convertible, cash asset. And those were the ones that were frozen because most of them were taking decisions that were not, financially sound. Let me put it that way. When you take the bank management, skills, you realize that, you have to match up your asset and your liabilities. But some of the banks, what they were doing is that they take people's liabilities on short term and then put them in a long-term asset. So some were acquiring things that, are not that liquid enough. And even if they should be liquid, it will not attract, the market value that is expected of it. So effectively, it was the upper part of the balance sheet that was struggling. And if you want to rescue such situation, all that you have to do is to pump in what? Money to, hold up that, cash needs. And, there was a delay. Let me put it that way, because we merged about, let's say, 7 banks, and those that we couldn't merge were the ones that had a lot of their funds. Because remember, the banks that were merged are the ones that were practicing, those asset liability mismatch, what do we call it? Techniques. And those were exposures they were giving to themselves. So effectively, if you want to rescue the situation, and a lot of what, most of the banks were having those, their monies with those banks that were merged because they were giving high interest rate. Let me give you a typical example. I know a lot of financial houses, a lot of banks lending among themselves to Heritage Bank, because it was promising a huge interest rate for which, whoever is giving them money will be comfortable to enjoy that interest rate. So in the end, it turns up that, okay, fine, that Heritage Bank has been merged with CBG. And so effectively, Heritage Bank might not have that enough funds. And bringing them together means that you have to be quick to respond by, putting more, cash in those banks. But there was a delay. And that delay is where the problem is, as far as, the economic rescue in terms of this exercise was concerned.
Now, let's still stay on, banking sector. Your tone suggests to me you have the view the entire reform exercise achieved nothing. Is that what I'm picking correct?
Well, even if we achieve something, it's not going to be now because of the model we adopted. Because actually we broke the structures of the banking space that we have. The banking structure was a lattice, and that lattice, we broke it. We're not supposed to break it, but rather we could have hold up, certain part of the existing structure, and then in the end, we'll still allow liquidity to flow. We've seen banks change hands, we've seen ownership of companies change hands without necessarily breaking what? The structures. It's the approach that we adopted that is what causing, all these problems that we had in the banking sector. And so if you are seeing interest rate coming down, if you are seeing, treasury bill rate coming down, and still banks cannot lend, then it tells you that there's another problem, and that problem is liquidity.
Doc, let me ask this question. Still staying on the performance of the economy and the reflection in terms of tangibles on the ground. I have spoken to a couple of poultry farmers who have attested to the fact that Planting for Food and Jobs has afforded them the opportunity to have a lot more maize to feed their poultry. I have spoken to a lot more, farmers who otherwise were not having the capacity which, Planting for Food and Jobs gave them. Are we not belittling the impact in terms of some of these promises and, their fulfillment?
Well, you see, the promises are there, but then the channels of executing it sometimes can cost you. The ideas were fantastic, the policies were fantastic, but as to the execution of it was the problem. Now, if you turns up to providing a policy, and the policy is more skewed towards already supporting individuals of the existing party, then obviously you are not making impact because you've narrowed your scope, more or less, where you are giving priority to people who bears party card. Then obviously the policy fails to assume that national scope that has been given to it.
Do you have evidence to the effect that companies and operators of some of these companies
clearly it's on the grounds. In some situations you have to indicate your affiliation before you can tap into certain facilities. And when it happens like that,
give me an example of such
you lose that kind of touch in terms of the policies that you're trying to roll out.
The point I'm making is, can you give me an instance where you personally do know?
Well, it shouldn't be for public consumption, but then in the end, I'm aware of some of these cases.
All right, now let's come to the as in the what His Excellency the President told us as to how things are with the economy of our nation. You make the point that he paints a picture of a sound economy, but looking ahead, and the fact that COVID-19 is still wreaking havoc across the world, and there's a new variant, and the fact that all these are countries that we, trade with, we have business relationships with. How is the outlook like for Ghana going into 2021?
If you talk about the outlook of the Ghanaian economy, you have to take into consideration how we are integrated globally. You cannot run away from that. We are here, getting news of second waves of, COVID coming up. We are here, hearing issues of some cases third wave and variants of this, virus, growing, in other parts of the world. Now, effectively, this has a lot of, impact on the Ghanaian economy, and not the Ghanaian economy alone. We're looking at the African continent. Now we're looking at a continent that survives on inflows from, the outside, world. And these are sources where we have our inflows at places that they're struggling every now and then as far as this COVID is concerned. Now, when you take your exports, right, some of your exports will go to markets where the markets are not that active, okay? When you take, your foreign direct investment, those markets that you expect foreign direct investment to come from to add value to your economy are places where this COVID is hitting. So going forward, we're not going to take it easy in the next, 6 months to 1 year. We should thank God that the vaccine, as far as this COVID is concerned, is in play now. And we're praying that if things get better, by the time we get to the 6 months to 1 year, we should be able to have, a vibrant, global economy picking up again. And in the end, it will turn up that, the Ghanaian economy can survive. Let me give you a typical example. You're exporting oil. Now, the global market of oil, as far as COVID is concerned, taking into consideration a freezing movement of people and all those, brought oil price down. Now, you rely on oil price as part of your inflows, oil revenue as part of your inflows. Effectively, this comes to reduce, the oil revenue that you generate. And in the end, it will affect your revenue, price. And without revenue, how do you, spend? You can't spend. And I'm not surprised that the budget review that we had in 2020 during the COVID, somewhere in June, the finance minister in his own wisdom indicated that we might sometimes forget about this, Fiscal Responsibility Act that limits, the government for borrowing about, 5% of its expected revenue from the Bank of Ghana, and then also to, increase the fiscal deficit that is giving room for enough expenditure and possibly which will allow for extra borrowing and all those. So these are all indicators that gives you the signal that we are prepared to face the consequence of COVID, and in the end, it gives room for extra spending as far as COVID is concerned.
All right, Doc, we will go for a short break. When we come back, there are two issues I would want for you to try. One has to do with where government should be looking at. You've already told us about the oil sector, but even with the oil sector, it was just, I think, last week, Thursday, that I was reading an article on Reuters to the effect that the OPEC countries, looking at the second wave of COVID-19, have decided to cut production so that there isn't too much supply and less demand. So there will be equity in terms of supply and demand. This was last week. And so that argument you made about, the oil and the fact that Ghana would produce and would seek to supply, but the demand would not be there. Is that wholly true an argument, considering what I read that the OPEC countries are thinking about?
Well, if you look at the OPEC and their strategies of controlling oil price on the global market, it can only have impact to a certain level. I mean, if they come and decide to reduce supply, it can only determine the price to a certain level. But the realities on the grounds will be that, okay, fine, OPEC will produce up to a supply level of maybe Q, which will determine a price of maybe P. But then in the end, when it turns up that, you know, the oil, the supply that they've provided to the market are not being demanded as a result of restrictions, the price will be forced to come down. So the control of OPEC to the price levels of, you know, fuel or hydrocarbons is up to a certain level. It's not, you know, a holistic control. The actual demand on the market really determines the price.
All right, Doc, we'll go for a short break. When we come back, should governments be looking in terms of revenue generation? It's obvious. It's been difficult for the government for the past 4 years to internally raise, you know, funds. If externally that's going to be problematic, where do we look at? Number two has to do with our debt portfolio and how to manage it, especially when we'll be looking a lot more at the external when it comes to funding projects in the country. We'll be right back. And it's 8 minutes to the top of the hour 9 here on ETV Live on Fact Sheet. If it's not a fact, we don't discuss. Tonight, my guest has been Dr. Lord Mensah. We've been talking about the economy per the position and the picture that His Excellency the President Nana Addo Dankwa Akufo-Addo painted for us during the last State of the Nation address he presented today in Parliament when the 7th Parliament met to receive him. Doc, so I was asking the question, where should Ghana be looking at, considering internally generated funds is being a bit of a problem? And number two, considering that the world itself is looking at, you know, its own self-preservation. Some countries are printing money to sustain themselves. Where should Ghana be looking in terms of funding its own projects?
Yeah, Sami, at this time it's going to be, tough. Let me put it that way. Looking at our, you know, debt level, which is giving us a signal that we are almost, you know, exhausting our debt, you know, service capacity. If you ask me, and looking at what is happening across the globe, we shouldn't, you know, target too much on increasing our expenditure so much. Some, you know, some in quotes, capital expenditures can be sacrificed. Let's focus more on essential, you know, expenditure, the mandatory ones like salary, like servicing of debt, interest payment, and all those. But then, if a government is hard up and the government realizes that, you know, external sources of funding is difficult, and at the same time, looking inwardly, if they have to borrow from the local environment and it will compete so much with the private sector, the government has no option than to increase taxes. And obviously, we should embrace ourselves for that. In a way that the government can survive for all Ghanaians. So effectively, if you are struggling in terms of your external inflows, and then possibly, the levels at which you can borrow in your, you know, local setting tends up to be, you know, quite difficult in terms of, you know, squeezing the private sector out of business, because obviously if the government goes to the market to borrow and the private sector also goes to the market to borrow, institutions will not like to lend to the private man. They will be comfortable with the government, because the assurance is there. But hey, let's not forget, the government in itself is also struggling, because in the past few months, you know, what I know is that government is even struggling to raise treasury bills, you know, as a way of, raising money. Government is struggling. And the question that comes into mind is, why would the government be struggling to raise money? They set a target, they don't meet it. What is the signal out there? Because Treasury bill, as far as I know, is one of the shortest, possible means of, lending or borrowing, for which every investor that doesn't have confidence in the long term will fall on. And if you look at our, Ghanaian space of investment, chunk of the investments are in such, market. And so I was, struggling, to understand why government will go to the market to borrow money, through treasury bills, securities, and they will not meet the target. That means that the investor confidence, even in the short term, is very low. That is the signal. So therefore, those institutions that are providing the funds to the government will require that possibly government increase the interest rate. So they might, because the risk, if the uncertainty is high, or it could be that the government didn't time the market well. But hey, I wouldn't say there should be a timing, as far as raising monies through treasury bills are concerned. So if government, that is the ultimate, borrower that investor can have confidence in, is struggling to, raise money through treasury bills, then I can tell you that the signals are not that clear. So for me, we should embrace ourselves for possibility of, government introducing more taxes.
Are bonds an option for the government?
Well, bonds, before you go to bonds, you have to think about treasury bills. Bonds are in the long term. If you want to invest in bonds, you have to be very certain, you have to be sure. And I don't know of the Euro bond market. As far as I know, the investor who is sitting out there in a COVID, tight environment, is also struggling as far as funds are concerned. So we have to be.
Is it not dependent on the coupon rate that these bonds would be requiring? For instance,
the coupon rate is there, but if you can afford the coupon rate, looking at a situation where you are spending about 50% to pay of your revenue to pay for interest, okay, if you can continue to borrow beyond a level that you know that when you generate revenue in your environment, 50% of it is going to what? Pay for just interest alone. Okay, just interest alone. Then you can go ahead to pick any, coupon rate. As for coupon rate, every investor is looking for higher interest rate. But then in the end, if the risk is so high, they will slap you with higher coupon rate. So sometimes you hear government goes to the bond market and comes home over subscription and all those. I can tell you, it gives the signal that the interest rate that is being offered or the coupon rate that is being offered is beyond, what they expected. That is why they are giving out, funds. And you remember, those funds that comes to our environment are people's pension funds and all those. And so those investors are not, dummies. They also understand the space that they are putting their money. A risky space which offers higher returns. And that is why we are able to attract, bonds, especially Euro bonds, into our environment. But can we afford to, continue to pay higher coupon rate at a level where we are spending more than 50% of our revenue to pay for just interest, and then just interest alone, interest service alone?
Okay. I'm grateful you made time to speak to me tonight.
Thank you very much, Samir. You're always welcome.
And it's good to always speak to you. That's Dr. With the University of Ghana Business School, the Finance Department, joining us this evening for a discussion on the President's final State of the Nation address, that which has to do with the economy, the expectations, looking into the future, the outlook, and how things are likely to pan out. On that note, I'd like to thank you for being a part of tonight's edition of Fact Sheet. Here, if it's not a fact, we don't discuss it. Tomorrow, God willing, there'll be a repeat broadcast of the show live on ETV at exactly 10 a.m. My name is Samuel Chen, and I wish you a good evening.
In 2017, it appeared to some like the same old refrain when we said farmers and agriculture would get the highest priority. But we can see the difference it makes when a government treats farmers with respect and spends resources and expertise on agriculture. We have seen the dramatic turnaround of our agricultural fortunes due to the progressive policies that have improved the living standards of farmers in the country. The excellently executed